Hey everybody, it's Chris instead of Howie this week. Howie's actually on a train heading to Western Ukraine as we speak, so he couldn't be here live to do the show. What we're going to do though is air a few interviews that Howie has done in his travels, specifically two from Georgian activists and one with a Ukrainian activist. So we'll air those videos as the show this week, and then Howie will be back next week, as normal. If you want to keep up with what Howie is doing, he is sending back reports. He's calling them the dispatches from Europe, and you can read them at howiehawkins.us. The most recent one, which just went out yesterday, is a reflection on the 2024 US elections. Before we start, I also want to encourage everyone to go check out New Green Horizons, which is our new webzine. You can find it at newgreenhorizons.us. But it's our goal is for it to be a place where Greens can post, campaign reports, local activity reports, strategy papers, issue papers, and we can have a place for Greens to discuss green policies, green ideas, and have debates about important issues to the party. You can also read Howie's dispatches posted there, but we have new and archival content coming out every week. So again, I just wanted to encourage everyone to check out New Green Horizons at newgreenhorizons.us. In addition to going there and reading, we also welcome submissions. So if you have something you want to write about, a topic that you'd like to discuss, you can go to our website and go through the process of submitting and get published yourself. So please check it out and share. Help us spread the word with this new webzine that we just started. With that, I will, let these videos get started. It starts with an interview with Georgian pro-democracy activist Alex Scrivener, and then it talks to Irakli Iratadze, another Georgian democracy reporter and journalist, and then it closes out with Ukrainian climate activist Svetlana Lomanko. So enjoy, everybody. Again, check out newgreenhorizons.us, and we'll see you next week, where Howie will be back live as usual.
Hello everybody, this is Howie Hawkins and I'm with Alex Scrivener, who's with the Democratic Security Institute in Tbilisi, Georgia. And he's a progressive left activist and political analyst. And we just went through this election in Georgia. And Alex, why don't you tell us, how the election was conducted and what problems there have been with the results that came out?
Yeah, this is, to give some context first, I guess, this election was absolutely pivotal and seen as very important, maybe the most important election in modern Georgian history. On the one side, you had the Georgian Dream Party, which has been in power in one way or the other since 2012, although in previous years it's been in power in a very different guise. And it's sort of transformed itself from being a sort of moderately social democratic, wide-ranging party that was pro-European to one which has become aligned with Viktor Orban and the more, I suppose, populist conservative, to put it mildly, tendency in Europe, and one which it's been, which is, I suppose, more undermining Georgia's European Union membership prospects than supporting it. And the context there is Georgians are overwhelmingly in favour of joining the European Union in all opinion polls, and in fact a referendum that was held in 2008 showed that, depending on when you ask, who you ask, but between 70 and 90%, about 80% I guess, of Georgians wish to join the European Union. Russia is very unpopular here because 2 regions of the country are occupied by Russian troops. And generally people here are sympathetic to the Ukrainian side in the Russia-Ukraine war, having themselves gone through in 2008 a Russian invasion, albeit one that was much shorter in duration than the current war that's going on in Ukraine. So in this context, we have a situation where the Georgian Dream Party is running for a fourth term in office, and the guy behind Georgian Dream, the billionaire Irakli is perhaps the most powerful man in the country. He has a glass palace perched on top of the capital city, from which he basically effectively runs the country, even though he has no official state title. He's the Prime Minister. Irakli is seen as being less powerful than he is. And we have this election where his party has been put against an array of smaller opposition parties that have agreed to cooperate to replace his government. So it's seen overwhelmingly as being a referendum on Georgia's European Union integration, and a sort of choice between a policy towards Russia that is more collaborationist, I guess the people who critique it would say, and what Georgian Dream would say is more a recognition of the reality that Russia poses a threat, and the West is not going to help Georgia fight them off. So we have a situation where going into this election, Georgian Dream was quite unpopular, it seemed, because in spring they passed a very unpopular law called the Russian. Well, it was called the Russian law, but it was called by its opponents. It was dubbed the Russian law because it was very similar to legislation that was passed 10 years ago in Russia against civil society and NGOs, effectively forcing basically all civil society organisations in Georgia to register as foreign agents of foreign influence in Georgia, sort of undermining them and sort of putting them on the register, effectively equating them as being enemies of the people. Most Georgian NGOs and civil society organisations, public movements, refused to comply with this legislation, but there are huge protests because it's seen as the first step towards a crackdown on free speech, a crackdown on civil society. And back in 2000, back in this spring, maybe a large percentage of the country out on the streets protesting. But the protests stopped because people thought, well, we have the elections in October, and therefore there is the opportunity to replace this government and therefore stop this Russian-style anti-NGO law. Now, obviously, we've had the elections now, and the ruling party claims it has won 54% of the vote, according to official statistics. The exit polls, though, that were taken by two polling organisations, admittedly both polling organisations were commissioned by opposition-leading TV channels, suggested that they only won 42% of the vote, or one of them, I think, 40% of the vote. So that would not have been enough to win them the election. So somehow the official results have ended up being 10 to 12% more favourable to the ruling party than exit polls suggest. Now that sometimes happens, polling can be something that's wrong, but there are evidence from different monitoring organisations that came here to observe the elections that there were irregularities in this election. There were instances of sort of a general atmosphere of intimidation at polling stations. A lot of polling stations would have cameras set up, for example. I think the OSCE preliminary assessment said that 24% of polling stations, the secrecy of the voting process was not completely guaranteed, and that led to a situation where the opposition would say it was not a free and fair election, and in fact they do claim also that the election was effectively rigged. And the President of Georgia has come out, called a massive protest yesterday, and the main street was full of people yesterday protesting because none of the opposition parties nor the President of the country recognises that these elections were held fairly, and they allege that elections were fixed, and there is evidence to suggest this election fell short of international standards, that's something that's kind of developing here on the ground in terms of what the political implications of that will be. But effectively, we're in a situation where we could be facing a political crisis going forward in this country.
So, give a little more detail on some of the irregularities or violations of the election process. What did voters face when they tried to vote And I guess it was somewhat different in the city versus the rural areas.
Yeah. So I mean, the assessments are obviously still ongoing from the various domestic and international organisations that were observing the vote. But the indications are that at the very least there was use of administrative resources to support the campaign of the ruling party, and that there was a sort of atmosphere of, I think one of the people at the press conference, I think characterised it. I mean, international observation, various international observation missions characterised it. I don't remember which one, unfortunately. Characterised it as this was an election in which Big Brother was watching you. Every polling station, more or less, had ruling party officials put in cameras watching who had come to vote. There was a strong presence of pro-government officials at the polling stations. And sort of suggestion was that these people were being pressured in some way, implicitly or explicitly, to vote in favour of the government. There are also, as I said, allegations that there definitely was a case captured on video in the south of the country where a ballot box was being stuffed with multiple ballots. That particular polling station results was cancelled, but there are allegations from the opposition that the extent of fraud in this election went beyond that. It's still a bit too early to know the exact situation, but the feeling amongst people I talk to here is that this election was not a free and fair election to European standards. That's what people are saying to me from the civil society sector in this country, and yeah, it's a very difficult situation.
So you described it as a political crisis. The president called for a demonstration. Tens of thousands at least showed up last night. So what are the next possible steps for the opposition? I know they've said they may not take their seats in the parliament. What could happen, and what do you think will happen?
Well, the opposition have said yes, that they won't participate in parliament. They're going to boycott the institutions, and they've already started protests. What happens from now on is unclear, but it seems likely that the opposition will continue to hold protests in Tbilisi and in other cities, and it seems likely that there will be weeks or months of ongoing protest against these election results, and it's really very difficult to tell how this could go. The government, of course, on their part, say this election was a demonstration of support for them, but it would, if it's true, if they're right, and the government did win this election by the percentage that they say, it means that there are parts of the country where they won by 90 or 95% of the vote, which some people say is a little bit implausible, and it means also that they won a higher proportion of the vote, significantly higher than they did 4 years ago at the previous election, before they had undertaken a range of very unpopular moves, such as the Russian-style foreign agent law. So if we were to believe these results are correct and not the result of any kind of manipulation or fraud or intimidation, then we would have to believe that these quite unpopular measures, which were polling suggests were overwhelmingly opposed by large sections of Georgian society, in fact boosted the ruling party's popularity significantly, which I think in the eyes of some people here stretches credulity. But going forward, it is very difficult to tell what will happen. It's possible on the one hand that protests will continue for a while, and then eventually the government will prevail, and we end up in another 4 years at least of Georgian Dream rule, which a lot of people in the civil society sector and the opposition fear might lead to further reform and heritage. It's been signalled, for example, that the ruling party has said it will try and ban opposition parties, which obviously is not promising from a democratic point of view. But it's also possible that the protest movement succeeds in forcing the government to make concessions, but it's very difficult to know what will happen next.
And of course, the Russians are saying if something happens, it's going to be what they call a color revolution, which, talk about how Georgians feel about that, particularly people in the West who buy that Russian characterization of popular uprisings as somehow stimulated by the West.
Yes.
As if you guys don't have your own thoughts about things.
Exactly. I mean, I think the characterization of popular uprisings and revolutions as being sort of color revolutions and therefore sort of less legitimate or illegitimate is a very successful piece of Russian propaganda that has very successfully penetrated the minds of many people on the progressive side of politics in the West, unfortunately. People who self-style as progressives and maybe even revolutionaries see a popular street movement against an authoritarian government, a revolution actually, and seem to quite often oppose that instead of supporting it. And we don't just see it in this part of the world, we see it in places like Hong Kong, where pro-democracy protesters often didn't get enough support from certain sections of the progressive side of Western politics. But yes, I mean, I'm not saying, I don't know, or there's no, I'm not saying that what happens here necessarily leads to a kind of Maidan or revolutionary scenario. Nothing can be ruled out. I think there's a whole spectrum of potential outcomes from this crisis. But generally speaking, people in countries like Georgia, including the progressives in this country and the people who fight for human rights, workers' rights in this country, and in other countries in the region such as Ukraine and Moldova, all favour a democratic political system, all favour Western-style political democracy in the sense that we should be able to replace our government at the ballot box in free and fair elections, and we also deserve the right to be free of our Russian imperial masters, or for Georgia, for example, Georgia has been controlled, dominated, conquered by Russia for over 200 years, 240 years or more. And Georgia has, throughout that time, tried consistently to break away from the imperial yoke. And obviously, since 1981, Georgia has been independent, alongside many other former republics of the Soviet Union. And like the Ukrainians, the Georgians too wish to be able to define their own future and wish to be able to build their own country free from Russian imperialist domination. And from a Western perspective, obviously, talking about Russian imperialism, is not obviously the major threat to people in the United States, but it is a major threat here, and it's a major threat in Ukraine. And I think people in this part of the world want to see more solidarity for the struggles of the peoples of Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, and so forth.
I've been reading that some of the younger leftists in Georgia are looking back to the first elected socialist government in the world, which was in Georgia. After the Russian Revolution, Georgia became independent and elected the Social Democratic Party by over 80%, and they ruled Georgia for a few years. How does that memory play on the left more broadly in Georgia?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously is a point of great pride in Georgia. That government, between 1918 and 1921, which was crushed by the Soviet invasion in 1921, which ended the democratic socialist experiment that Georgia represented at the time, which was quite successful. That Georgian government managed to implement huge progressive socialist reforms way ahead of its time in a country where you wouldn't think it would be possible. Introduced women's suffrage, equality, sorry, land reform, and it was a very successful government. Sorry, and that socialist experiment, democratic socialist experiment of the 1920s, was crushed by Russian imperial forces, by force of arms. And here we are, over 100 years later, and we are still fighting Russian imperial designs on the country. Excuse me, sorry. Oh.
Okay, we're back. We got Alex a glass of water. So we were talking about the first elected socialist government in the modern world, and here in Georgia, and what it means to Georgians today and maybe for its future.
Yeah, so that government is a really big part of modern Georgian history. The First Republic, run by the Mensheviks, so the Democratic Socialists in Georgia. It was only lasted 3 years, but that government achieved so much. It's we got women's suffrage at the same time, or earlier than many Western European countries as a result. In 3 years, that government achieved a pretty comprehensive and sort of egalitarian land reform. And that government, had the kind of loyalty of the vast majority of the Georgian people. It had to be crushed by the Soviets, because the Soviets did not want to see a democratic socialist government succeed. Its model of Soviet communism was one of oppression and dictatorship, and it did not want to see a flourishing example of democratic, egalitarian governance on its, right next door. And so in 1921, the Soviet Red Army invaded, and the Georgian government went into exile. And Georgia didn't get its independence back then until 1981. And that socialist government, it was an example, it was an experiment. At that time, democratically elected socialist governments didn't happen very often. In fact, it was one of the first in the world. So actually there was a delegation from many Western democratic socialist governments, socialist parties, from the International. And one of the visitors to Georgia at that time was Ramsay MacDonald, who went on to be the first Labour Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So it was a very exciting time to be in Georgia, and it was a great tragedy that this great experiment in progressive governance 100 years ago was crushed by Russian military force, which is a pattern we see repeated today. Russian imperialism is no friend of progressive politics, quite the opposite. Russia represents an imperialist, far-right view of the world that is across our region and even the world, steadfast in favour of all the forces that wish to crush everything that people on our side of the political spectrum hold dear. Now, unfortunately, there are parts of the Western progressive spectrum that can't see that, and only see things in terms of geopolitics, don't recognise places like Georgia or Ukraine as being legitimate, independent cultures who have the right to determine their own future. They see it only as pawns on the big chessboard between the West and Russia, and it's a patronising and terrible way of looking at the world that completely robs us of agency. Where in fact, as we've said, Georgia was the country where we had one of the first democratically elected socialist governments in the world. This is a country that deserves to exist, deserves to be free and make its own choices in its own right.
So, I started this part of the interview by referencing, young lefties in Georgia who, are looking at that example to inspire their activities. How about the broader Georgian society? How do they feel about that period of independence and its socialist aspect?
Yeah. So, obviously, the left in Georgia is very weak, unfortunately, and part of that, the reason for that is because the Western left, when it opens its mouth about our region, the loudest voices tend to be against us, tend to support, implicitly or explicitly, those who are trying to fight us. So that's a big part of the reason why the left is so weak here. Because for the ordinary Georgian who's not aligned, they look west and they see prominent, supposedly progressive voices, the likes of Jill Stein, seemingly very supportive of Vladimir Putin and other Putin-aligned dictatorships, while not being supportive at all of Ukraine's fight for its freedom and by extension Georgia's right to freedom. So that's why the left here is very, very weak.
So it makes it harder for the left here to organize around left principles because they see the left as supporting Russian imperialism?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, not all of the left, obviously. I mean, you are a great example, Howie, of someone who's not like that. But the loudest voices tend to be at the very best lukewarm about our fight for liberation. And that has an effect here domestically. Yeah. I mean, there are leftists here, but they're divided, they're small, and they're not very powerful. I mean, effectively, the left here tends to align with the liberals in the sense that, both of us believe in basic democratic principles, the right to have free and fair elections, the right to organise, the right to free speech and so forth. So those are the battles that we're having here, in terms of national survival against the Russian threats. So I think on those issues we're kind of aligned with people perhaps rather different. But I mean, in terms of your question about how does mainstream Georgian society see the First Republic between 1918 and 21, I think there's a lot of pride throughout Georgian society, actually, not just on the left but even on the right, about that period of independence. The difference being, I think those on the left would be more aware of how the left character, the socialist character of that government, and how progressive it was, for that time, over 100 years ago. Whereas I think most ordinary Georgians will just see it more in nationalist terms, as that we were free from Russia for that period, and that was a time where we experimented with freedom from the empire. But I think most Georgians, if not all Georgians, would be very proud of that period of independence in the early 20th century.
Okay, Alex, I appreciate, giving us your perspective on this. And, the thing that I take away is to lefties back in the U.S., we need to be in solidarity with the left, particularly in this part of the world, which small countries like Georgia and Ukraine don't want to be pawns of imperialist powers, whether it's U.S. imperialism or Russian imperialism or any other imperialism.
Yeah.
And in the West, we should be hearing and listening to our counterparts in these countries. And it's very significant. What the Ukraine war in particular, I think, will have a big impact on what kind of future we all have, as well as the future of Georgia. Maybe you could talk a little bit more, and then we'll wrap up, about what are the possibilities for resistance on the part of the Georgia opposition to this, what the president called falsified results.
Yeah.
So, what kind of, activities, they can boycott the parliament, but what about the social movement?
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is an important question, but it's one that I'm kind of unable to answer because it's such a difficult question. I mean, I think mostly the atmosphere on the ground is obviously angry, but it's also shell-shocked. I mean, people weren't expecting this to happen quite in the way it has happened. And I think people are still reeling from the shock of what's happened over these elections. And I think over time it will become apparent what the strategy is, not just from the opposition, but from civil society and social movements, and from the government as well, for what it's going to do. It seems to be signalling a further crackdown against civil society. Maybe after elections, and they've now got the result that they wanted, maybe there's a period where they walk back a little bit and don't continue the repressive streak that they were on before. But we'll see. I think it's very open. Anything could happen. But I think what I would say is what they could do, apart from boycotts and protests, I think this is where the lack of a strong institutional left could really damage any protest movement here, in the sense that the sort of protest that would actually make the government sit up and listen and actually have to perhaps compromise in some way are the sort of protest actions that the left, and a strong institutional left, would be able to play a big role in. So, for example, strike action, or workers' protests, social movements with better organisation. Those are things that the left are very good at historically. But because the left is so weak here, the sort of protest movements being led by liberals or people to the right of them, that's sort of not in their DNA to quite the same extent. So it's very difficult to see what they could do. I think lack of a left, a lack of a sort of strong union movement, for example, is a weakness of civil society in this country, and I think it might be a weakness that contributes to the government be more likely to be able to get its way. But I can't predict what might happen. Anything could happen. Protests could die down. They could ramp up. There could be some level of unrest and tension. But it's far too early to be able to tell, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, we will be watching, and we'll also, I'm sure you will be watching too, what happens in our country, the United States, because how do we resist, a second Trump presidency with the repression he has announced he would do?
Yeah.
Or if he resists when he loses. So the lack of strong labor movement and organized left in the U.S. is a problem we got to deal with too.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, part of the calculus, I think, of the government here is that Trump will win, and Trump will, this government sees itself as aligned with sort of Trump-adjacent ideology. Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, who is again another person aligned with that political tendency, immediately came to Tbilisi after the election results came through to congratulate the government here. So this kind of right-wing authoritarian tendency across Europe and the US and the West, and actually beyond the West, is actually quite well linked together. And there's a direct line from Trump's anti-democratic tendencies and anti-democratic leanings, and those of this government here. They are very much cut from very similar cloths, so to speak.
Yeah, the leaders are both billionaires, or at least Trump claims to be. So, well, we got our work cut out for us. Thank you, Alex, and we'll have more conversations in the future.
Thanks.
Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I'm here in Tbilisi, Georgia, and I'm going to interview Irakli Iratadze, who hopefully I pronounced her name right. She's a political economist here in Georgia, and I first became aware of her when she did an interview that appeared in Postly, which is a Russian socialist publication, and Tempest, an American socialist publication, talking about the movement here in Georgia against authoritarianism, against the Foreign Agents Registration Law. And we are speaking a couple days after an election, which people have a lot of questions about. So this is Irakli Iratadze, and I'm going to introduce her again briefly. She's a political economist here in Tbilisi, Georgia, who I became aware of after an interview she did with some other left-wing people in Georgia about the movement against the Foreign Agents Law and authoritarianism in Georgia. And now we're also speaking after this election, about which there are a lot of questions. So, Ia, tell us about the movement in the spring. Why don't we start there? And
yes.
What people on the left and the West should know about your struggle.
Yes, so in spring this year, 2024, the government of Georgia, they initiated the law of transparency of foreign agents, which was actually quickly called a Russian law in Georgia. And it was called a Russian law because a lot of critical actors, civil societal actors, and also broader public in Georgia, they were sure that this was very similar to the law that was earlier implemented in Russia. So what was the law about? The Georgian government claimed that their aim was to increase the transparency of funding of the non-governmental organizations in Georgia, and all the organizations that receive more than 20% of funding from abroad, they have to register themselves in the special register as agents. And but the critical voices on the other side, they opposed this framing of the law by the government, because a lot of people, including myself, we saw this law as a very dangerous tool for establishing more state control and also consolidating authoritarianism in Georgia, because this is also exactly what this law was used for in Russia. So since we saw this danger that the government would then not only make most of the organizations, not only NGOs, but also media organizations, trade unions, including maybe also social movements, everyone receiving funding from outside, to register themselves as agents, to label them as foreign agents. This is one danger. And another thing is that if organizations resist or deny to do so, they have to pay fines, and the fines are very high. So those organizations who cannot make it and who cannot pay it, they will automatically disappear and vanish. And considering that actually the civil society in Georgia is quite dynamic, it's very active, and everyone saw basically the danger that the government wanted to get rid of the critical voices, including people coming from NGOs or trade unions or academia and so on. So the movement in the spring and the protests, which went on for several weeks, and it was basically in some weeks every day, every evening there would be a protest, was calling the government to abolish this law, but that didn't help. Unfortunately, the law was passed this spring, but still most of the people who were protesting this spring, and I'm also speaking of myself, we are still very sure that the main aim of this law is it's anti-democratic. It's about strengthening the power of the government, and we also have to consider the foreign policy or the geopolitical aspect of the law. So this was happening in parallel with the government starting this very anti-Western rhetoric, so anti-European, anti-US rhetoric, which has not happened in Georgia so far. It's happening for the first time. So many of us saw the danger of, on the one hand, this consolidation of autocracy within Georgia, and on the other hand, Georgia turning more towards to Russia and becoming very critical and even aggressive against the USA, Europe, and so on. So these were two parallel things going on in the last few months. I mean, it's still going on because we just had elections, and even though the official results say that the government party won, now, I mean, today there is the first protest announced again this evening, that a lot of people have the feeling that this is not the right, that the elections were falsified. So this conflict still goes on. So the government trying to basically make the shift both in the inner politics, become more autocratic and more authoritarian, and on the other hand turn more towards Russia. This is all very dangerous, and also from my personal perspective, I see a lot of danger for Georgia in that. And I think what's important maybe to know for the left outside Georgia, because there has been also a lot of critique against, or questions at least, against this movement in spring, why these people are protesting, I mean, about this law and so on. But it's important to see that all of this resistance that started, well, it didn't start in spring, but which was really articulated so well in spring, it was not necessarily about how much closer Georgia should get to the USA or to Europe, but it was more about the fear that the Georgian government is turning towards Russia, and that's the fear that we see. Because this is not only about foreign politics, we know that it's also about our own democracy within Georgia, and that's also something I'm most concerned about, that what if we don't have soon spaces for critique and resistance. So that's
when you went out in the streets in the spring,
yes,
and when you go out tonight, there are people, including on the left, especially on the left in the United States, who will say, you're just proxies of the CIA for a quote-unquote color revolution against Russia. So, are you a proxy? Is the CIA
No.
telling you what to do?
No, that would be misinterpretation, and it would also be oversimplifying things, because things are not that simple. No, I mean, most of the people, and I'm talking about people who I know, my friends, my colleagues, and basically everyone around me, and people who I have worked with, or organizations I have worked with over the last few years were involved in these processes. They are going out to the street because they see this danger that I just mentioned. So first of all, losing that level of democracy that we have right now in Georgia, and this is really dangerous. And secondly, that Georgia also loses all the legitimacy from outside, because I mean, Georgia is a small country and it has always gone through some pressures from the West, so to say, which of course, I mean, we can assess it very critically, and I have myself written also on this in a very critical manner. But right now, when we are facing the situation where it's not about balanced politics, I mean, unfortunately, our government is not trying to carry through balanced politics and maneuver between Russia and the West, but it's clearly leaning more towards Russia and attacking the West, and that's dangerous. I mean, that's what it is about, and not that people here in Georgia are somehow protecting the US or EU interests. That would be misinterpretation.
So Georgia's a small country, and I know people here are concerned that the international system is leaving them at the mercy of outside big powers. Russia certainly, but also the EU and the West. Talk about the economy of Georgia. You and your colleagues have talked about it being a transit hub for capitalism.
Yes.
You know, between the EU and China in particular, but also Turkey, the US, Russia,
Yes.
you know, having investments here and interests. And so how does that play out in the politics we're talking about?
Yes, I mean, that's we are actually in a very vulnerable situation, and this is vulnerable not only in terms of this political constellations, but of course economics and geopolitics come in. And first of all, as you say, Georgia is a very small country, which means it has actually very little political power on the global scale. And secondly, Georgia's economy is what I also use this term. It's a peripheral economy. It's a very dependent economy, dependent on the foreign capital. It's dependent on foreign currency. It's dependent on, we have a huge trade deficit, so foreign goods and so on. So it's a very vulnerable economy, right? I mean, the inflow of foreign capital, foreign currency, remittances, all that plays a very important role that the economy remains more or less stable. And then comes the geopolitical additional layer to it, because of Georgia's geographical location, situated somehow between Asia and Europe. There is an European interest that comes in, and Chinese interest, and of course Turkey's, especially when it comes to bigger infrastructure projects, like for example the most recent disputed project is this Anaklia deep sea port, and who is going to build this port, whether it's the Chinese investment or European or US. Here you see then the clash of these geopolitical interests. So especially coming out of this very vulnerable, I would say, and unstable economic situation, I think it's even more important for the Georgian government. Doesn't matter whether it's the current government or governments in future, that they should really carry very careful policy, very more trying maybe to balance out all these interests and not take the clear sides, because if the situation here gets unstable, politically even, right, then there is a huge danger that the foreign capital leaves the country, or there is a crisis in the banking system, in the financial system, and that can have very dangerous implications for the overall economy. So it's very fragile. And I see, I see a lot of economic risks, and not mentioning the sanctions. I mean, if there are even sanctions against Georgia and so on, I mean, that will be even disastrous for the country and for the overall economy. So this is why, I mean, to sum up this very fragile situation that Georgia is in economically, I think, unfortunately, also it does not allow the country to really pursue its, what one maybe call very independent politics, right? It's there are lots of conditionalities and conditions that have to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, it would seem if there's going to be a progressive left in Georgia that's successful, it's going to have to be linked to similar movements in other countries.
Yes, that would be important, for sure.
And the thing you hear about the movement in the spring, which was so massive, I mean,
yes.
What, like 10-15% of the population on the street at any one time? It was spontaneous. It wasn't
Yes.
led by a left party or trade unions.
No.
It was young people. So
Yes.
there seems to be popular sentiment, but Georgia has yet to consolidate a left or a green left party.
Yeah.
You want to say a few words about the difficulties there?
Yes, I mean, that would be, for sure, that would be very important, that we do have at some point leftist party and green party, which we don't right now, unfortunately. Yes, that would be really important, because I think there is a truly also really a gap. If you look at the political party landscape of Georgia, there is a gap there. You don't really have parties that represent leftist ideas or green ideas. And on the other hand, there is also a gap if one looks at the voting patterns of the population. Usually you have a huge chunk of the population who are not really happy with the existing constellation, the way the parties are, but then when they go to elections, they have to choose some party, they have to vote for someone. And this was also the case now at these elections, that many voted for the opposition parties, not because, including myself, they are very keen of this or that particular opposition party, but only because they didn't want to vote for the government. So if there are left and green parties, that would definitely broaden also the choice for the Georgians who they can vote for. And I really hope that we do have these kind of parties in the nearest future. And then of course the international linkages and all these connections will be very, very important too.
Well, I think those of us in the American left can relate to what you just said. We have similar problems in building a real alternative, and people are not satisfied with what they're getting from the major parties. So why don't we wrap up there with that commonality, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello everybody, this is Howie Hawkins. I'm in Kyiv in Ukraine, and I'm here with Svetlana Romanko, who is really a world famous climate activist. I marched with her at the climate march in New York City, and some pretty prominent people came up to her, like people we know, Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein, and climate activists from Africa and Europe and Latin America, Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland. And we were marching with the indigenous, and Svetlana had a traditional Ukrainian shirt on, and mostly American Indians around her, but she's got dark hair, dark eyes, and they were looking at her like, what tribe is she from? And one of them asked me, I said, she's from Ukraine. And she said, oh, land back, which is the slogan of American Indians now in terms of getting justice from the system. So I'm really glad we can interview Svetlana here about climate issues and issues about Ukraine. So I'm going to stop this and then turn it around and start talking to Svetlana. I should add that if the music you hear we're in a Crimean Tatar restaurant. So I think that banner behind me on the left is indigenous to the Crimean Tatars, as the music is that you hear in the background. So this is Svetlana Romanko, and the first question I want to ask is, we're sitting here right after we got the shocking news that Donald Trump's going to be the next president, and may have certainly the Senate and maybe the House. So you're speaking to Americans, and you've been campaigning for stronger fossil fuel sanctions on Russia and support from the people around the world for Ukraine's struggle for national liberation. So, what are your thoughts on today, and what do you want to say to Americans about particularly the sanctions question, which is central to the work you're doing?
Oh yes, thank you so much, Howie, and such a pleasure to meet you here in Kyiv, because we marched shoulder by shoulder just a year ago during New York Climate Week, and we tried to bring the message that the fossil fuel dictatorship must end and stop enslaving the whole nations and providing lots of grief and losses for the families across the globe, including Ukraine, of course, because Russian war in Ukraine has reached to its third year, and I can tell it's been extremely hard. And I think that yes, the elections outcome is completely surprising, and I would just ask a question: what made Americans wanting Trump to get into power again? It might be difficult response to this question, because the cost of living crisis, energy insecurity, lots of conflicts across the globe, and lack of access to the basic services. Yes, this is all true, but I think we have so much in common. And here in Ukraine, we also have lost access to many of goods and rights, and it's going to exacerbate. And my call on the Americans will be not to give up, even if you vote differently, because America is still a democracy and we hope will stay so, but also to be proactive in helping the nations who are suffering, helping Ukraine. We know and we so much appreciate that many of you have helped. You invested a lot of your time and resources and political support into us being sustained and being able to oppose the horrific war of Russians here in Ukraine. And unfortunately, yes, we are not there at the point of the win, but the crisis of peace is the most common uniting reason for us to stay together and to share the path towards a better future. For that, I would ask you to sign on our political demands to the governments, including to the US government, but also G7 governments, to tighten the sanctions on Russian fossil fuels, because they are the root cause of the crisis we are all in. They are the root cause of the crisis of energy security that you experience, paying the huge bills for electricity and paying extra for the petrol, and of course we can all feel that pain and feeding families, but until we get the commonly agreed peace, not violent peace, not forced peace, and not making us, a sovereign nation, make any deals with Putin and Russia giving up territories. Just imagine one of your states could be taken by someone who has maybe more military power and is allowed to do so by the global leaders. It would be absolutely unacceptable situation. So this is for us, for Ukrainians, and we just call on you, please help us to defeat the Putin's evil, Russian evil, support our political demands, volunteer for Ukraine cause when you can, and help us to sustain non-violent peace and within our borders as a sovereign nation.
Yeah, I would remind people that maybe are squeamish about sending arms to Ukraine, that they're nonviolent actions, like under or defunding the Russian military machine with these sanctions on oil, gas, and coal.
Well, we advocate for exactly defunding Russia fossil fuel profits, because they will simply run out of money and won't be able to fund their military power, including buying weapons from North Korea, buying soldiers from North Korea, So there are different ways we can do it. And we just came from the Washington a month ago with a delegation of 18 Ukrainian mayors who brought their renewable energy plans, and they were asking the US government's officials, developing programs they met with, to sustain at least 30% of the costs they are sending as an aid to Ukraine for renewable energy deployment, because the winter here, including in Kyiv, is going to be extremely hard. And given that lots of, like the most of our energy infrastructure has been inevitably destroyed by Russians, we might run out of power for even 20 hours. So this is a very life, death and survival issue. So we need everything that can help Ukraine at the moment, and we are asking for, especially for helping the cities to rebuild on renewable energies, not on nuclear, which is also forced by, in a way, by the US money and US support, financial support, but this technology, given it really unsafety for the population, and that a few our nuclear power plants are still under occupation, it can't be taken as safe technology to implement for the years ahead. And of course, the last thing which we need, and I just spoke today to my Ukrainian colleagues who agree with me that tightening sanctions on Russian fossil fuel is a paramount issue of today, and we have all to invest in this as much as we can. So as soon as new Congress will take in the power on the Hill, we will be there asking them, doing political advocacy and asking them to tighten sanctions, and because it's not only Ukrainian cause, which is Ukraine is a far, we understand this, but it's also a cause for US own national security and energy security.
So there's three things we can do: push for the fossil fuel sanctions on Russia, tell the US to stop pushing nukes on Ukraine, and instead develop renewables.
Absolutely.
And you want to say a few more words about the renewables in terms of why they're more secure than these centralized power plants, whether they're nuclear or thermal?
Yes, our team has done brilliant work on this, especially the Ukrainian part of the team, and they said once that renewable energy is distributed. This is a true energy of independence, and it can't be destroyed by a single drone if it's installed in many houses. And these houses became independent, and they gain energy independence. And or even if we have 5 houses and we have microgrid, and we save money and we install one set of equipment to generate renewable power, it's still so much value in that, because what Russia is trying to do, they try to inflict the attacks on existing centralized energy infrastructure. As more centralized energy infrastructure we renew, rebuild, invest money into that, the more it will be destroyed, because it's an easy target for Russia. As Bill McKibben once said, he's a great supporter of the work that we are doing, and we are so grateful to him. He said once that Russia can't destroy sun and wind. It's free, and it always will be free, and no dictator can destroy sun and wind. So we have to use their power as much as we can to sustain our communities and to make them energy independent. And those cities I mentioned, from Kyiv to Mariupol, they have made very concrete plans of how much of renewable energy facilities they want to build, how much investment they need, and they are on the way of changing their energy future.
So you mentioned the study, your group is Razum We Stand. Tell people how they can find the website and those studies.
Yes, we have plenty of important reports. It came out recently. I would encourage you to visit our website, razumwestand.com, and to read all those reports, especially if you would like to see the Arctic report, which is one of the latest, and you will be shocked by the fact that Russia controls 90% of Arctic reserves of oil and gas. And if they are explored, if they are extracted from the earth, we can leave any hope for keeping in 1.5% of climate crisis aligned. No way this has happened, because 80% of gas and 60% of oil Russia is extracting from Arctic, and we can call it diffusing Russian carbon bombs in the Arctic that could save this planet. But this, of course, could not happen and would not happen without the U.S. support. So U.S. newly elected government will have to tighten sanctions on Arctic LNG too of Russia, but not only, for all Arctic activities that Russia is providing in that area, because that's where the might is.
Is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap this up to Greens and lefties in the United States?
You know, it's extremely, I would love, thank you, Howie, for this opportunity. And what I would say, it's very easy to get discouraged, but we can't afford the luxury of being upset. So it's not for us, it's not something that we can live with. The best thing we can do right now is to be really practical, to support each other, to see how we can help our countries to get into the better political path than they are, and to see what we can extract from this very dire political situation. But as much as we remain connected in solidarity and supporting each other, I think we can be much more beneficial for the planet, climate, and for peace than we are. And being politically active is extremely important. So when you see call to action, call to help, call to sign on, call to speak up, call to tell your to MP or your senator about something you want to get fixed, please do it. Please don't be inactive, because that's the worst thing that can happen to us all, become indifferent, inactive, and not interested.
I think it's a great message to end on, given what happened in the election yesterday. So thank you, Svetlana. And
I would like to end with a very patriotic thing. Thank you so much, Howie, because I just forgot to add it, but I will always say that Slava Ukraini, which means glory to Ukraine, and glory to America for the overall support that you have provided. I truly believe it's not the end, and we have to remain hopeful and very, very proactive and determined to end the world evil and Putin's evil, and to restore the just peace.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.